Welcome back to Treasures in Heaven, where we explore the intersection of eternal truth and everyday investments, from the coins in our pockets to the conditions of our souls. I'm your host, Daniel Catone, and today we are speaking with a scholar whose work sits right at the heart of our mission at Arimathea. Dr. John Buchmann is a Catholic moral theologian with a deep background in economics, ethics, and Catholic social teaching. He earned his PhD in religious ethics from the University of Chicago Divinity School, writing a dissertation that brought Adam Smith and St. Thomas Aquinas into conversation, a project that explores how we understand value, price, and justice in economic life. John currently serves as Director of Development at the Lumen Christi Institute, and he's previously held leadership roles at the Beatrice Institute and the Collegium Institute. He's also a convert to Catholicism, a father, and someone who has thought deeply about more money as more than just a medium of exchange, but as something with deep spiritual implications. So whether you're an investor, a theologian, or simply someone trying to follow Christ in a complex economy, this conversation is perfect for you. In fact, if you're interested in these topics, now is your chance to take a break and like and subscribe to the podcast. And welcome to the show, John.
Thank you so much.
It's really cool to be here. Yeah, this is great, man. You know, one of the things that's really quite powerful is the Catholic Church has written and taught a lot about money. And we're going to really get into that with you today, because I think that's one of your specialties. You're one of those rare people that combines theology and finance and theology. And that's just not something you see very often in our world. Someone like me, really. So it's pretty cool to do this with you.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think there are a lot of people who sort of segment life, and there's like the section of life that engages with theology and the section of life that doesn't. And so we get used to that, and it's a form of practical atheism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Underlying it is this claim that God doesn't matter for how one lives, and we don't really want to embody that in our actions.
Yep, you're 100% correct. And I guess, as we think about an integrated life, maybe we could start from the beginning. I read that you were a convert to the Catholic faith. Can you tell me a little bit about that journey?
Absolutely. I'm fortunate to have several friends who converted, and they had a lot of influence. But like most of the major shifts in my life, it all begins with an argument with a woman. This one was in Oxford.
Yeah.
And actually, very, very bright woman. And we had an argument about theology, and I was at that point very much a Protestant. And
what was your kind of Protestant?
So we were broadly evangelical. My father's actually a pastor
Mm-hmm.
in the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church. So obviously, theology, the church, God was very important to us. Key facet of our life growing up. He raised us in faith. And so at this point, I was doing what Protestants do. I pulled out the Bible, and we're arguing about a passage. And she had a very creative way of reading this passage that didn't really align well with the tradition. And I, of course, was trying to take what I understood to be the traditional understanding and defend it. We just went back and forth, back and forth. I got frustrated, as I sometimes do.
Yeah, you get frustrated having a theology debate with your future wife?
Not future wife.
Oh, okay.
Definitely not. But no, we finally, I got to the point where I just said, look, nobody's ever read it this way before. And then I stopped myself, because I realized that's an argument from tradition, and I wasn't supposed to believe in those. So I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up all night thinking about what it meant that I used an argument from tradition. I sort of caught myself. And, if arguments from tradition are valid, there are a whole lot of other ones that I haven't accepted, right? And so that really shook me. And I think that was the start. I had a good friend who he's a convert. He converted under Scott Hahn, became a Dominican, Father Cachetan Cuddy. He was a huge influence on my life. I went to Duke for a master's degree, where there were some great Catholic theologians at the time. Reinhard Hütter was my sponsor in RCIA. So a lot of good people, but I think that moment of realizing that I'd sort of backed myself into a corner, and I needed to ask, what was the proper authority for me in figuring out what to know, what to believe.
It's interesting that your conversion was so intellectual, and that it began with really an argumentation. How about your heart? How did Christ win your heart?
So I think he already had it in a way, right? Like, I think at that point, like, I had a deep faith. I had a good prayer life. I just didn't know everything there was. It's sort of like you can be in love with a person and not really fully know them yet, right?
Sure.
I mean, you could be in this situation.
We never
and
really
then,
do.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So I think of this more like I think the heart was there. I mean, obviously it's intensified, right? As things do. I mean, there've been the high points, the low points. I think we all go through these journeys, right?
Yeah.
But yeah. So I think of it less as a conversion of the heart because I think the heart was there, but the mind wasn't. I didn't know who my beloved was fully. I guess that's what it was.
Yeah, it's just really an integration. I mean, you talked about. I mean, we talked about integration of our life within Christ and how our minds and our hearts have to be integrated as well. You mentioned highs and lows. Can you tell me about a high that you've had?
I think one of the base ones. I mean, this is true for every convert. Like that moment of your conversion, I think is clearly a high, right? Like you enter the church, you receive the Eucharist for the first time. I think that's a key point.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I would look at that. I mean, I don't know. That's still the paradigmatic. I think for me, like that moment of first receiving.
That's really beautiful. And then a low moment.
Probably the most challenging times. So there have been two very challenging times in my life post conversion.
Yeah.
I mean, the one was my divorce, where I got full custody of kids. My then wife was mentally unwell, and I think that was a real point of questioning, shaking, as we sort of worked through that. And then the second would be when my daughter was diagnosed with cancer. Which, at that point in time, life is finally good again. Like I've got everything under control. At least I thought I had everything under control. Things were going well. Financially, we're good. The kids are flourishing. I've got everything sort of set up. And then it's like you throw this in the mix, and it's very challenging. As a single dad, to be a single dad that then has a kid who's in chemotherapy every day for 2 weeks in a row. Spending the nights in the hospital. That was a lot. And I think those 2 points were challenging. Although, in some ways, you learn because you also get to look back. Like as we live, as we grow, you get to look back and see sort of the ways in which God has taken care of you in each of the steps. So I think in some ways it's easier now because there've been enough challenging points. When the next one hits, it's just, well, this is how life is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like life isn't, it's not easy. At least, maybe for some people maybe they get this is the easy life. But I think for a lot of us, this is just how life is. There are challenges, and you face those challenges, and this is part of the story of the overcoming.
Yeah. What's your daughter's name?
Veronica.
Veronica. That's a beautiful name. We have a lot of listeners and viewers, and we like to ask everybody, please pray for Veronica and her healing, and for John and his family. Having gone through challenges, I mean, all of us do. These change who we are. Can you tell me a little bit about how these two particular challenges have changed you?
So I think there was a point, like I never want to. I don't want to denigrate my past self too much. Although I guess now that I'm a Catholic, I'm supposed to, right? We're supposed to be critics. But I think as an early convert, I didn't have a lot of empathy, right? So I think having seen more suffering, I have a lot more empathy with people. I understand the challenges that people are going through. I'm less judgmental. I still believe truths. I believe the truth, like the truths of the church, but I'm less judgmental of people sort of as they're struggling because I've seen that I also can struggle. And I think that was necessary for me.
We are in the school of love in this life, but the school of love is also the school of suffering. And it's funny you say that you become less judgmental, maybe a little softer, would you say?
A lot softer. Yeah, which is hard for me, former linebacker. We don't come by gentleness.
Yeah. Well, I work in finance. I get it. And I would just say, I mean, it's a beautiful thing that your heart of stone was replaced with a heart of flesh. And, I think as we age and go through the suffering and the challenges of life, we have a tendency to have a heart, hopefully over time, that becomes more like Christ's heart, which is the softest of hearts, right?
Yeah. I mean, you look at who he associated with
Yeah.
and who he was most gentle with, and then who he was hardest on. Who are the believers, right? The at least the parent believers, the people who are doing all of the religious things the way you're supposed to be doing. Those are the people he's hard on, and the people who aren't doing anything like what they're supposed to be, like he's approaching like gently and offering them like the better path, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's beautiful.
It is a very beautiful thing. You've done some amazing work, and I think I want to dive in a little bit into Adam Smith and St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm certainly not going to say St. Adam Smith. I have mixed feelings about the man, and this is a heady topic. So for our listeners and viewers, this is going to be closer to my other podcast, I think, Theology of Money, in some ways than even what I would normally do in Treasures in Heaven, which is these interviews. And so I'd like to start there. So can you tell us who Adam Smith is?
Sure. Adam Smith was a member of the Scottish Enlightenment, a philosopher. Well, at that point, they would have said a moral philosopher and an economist. Early stage, he wrote the book Wealth of Nations. People largely look at him as the founder of economics. Also wrote a book that people don't read as much, Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a fabulous book and very, very important in its own right also.
Okay. And when was he alive?
18th century.
Okay, so 1700s. And he's Scottish, not Catholic, right?
Not Catholic, right. Protestant. Now, how much he believed and what his beliefs were over time, that's debated hotly, along with a lot of other things. But I tend to think that he did have that strong sort of Calvinist belief underlying that maybe was tempered over time, but that it still shaped him very much.
Very interesting. So, it's largely considered that Adam Smith is the founder of economics, like you said. And it's often we point to him as sort of the one who flushed out the ideas of capitalism in their full sort of philosophical, economically philosophical, I guess, sense. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
One of the things he realized, I mean, I look at it as a fully moral project. One of the things he realized is that when we're impoverished, we tend to do bad things, right? So if I have the money, I'm probably going to be okay with feeding grandma, even though she's not productive, right? But if I'm starving to death, maybe I'm going to say, we're going to do away with grandma so that I can keep my kids alive, right? That was what he was worried about. Infanticide, killing of the old, these things that happen when you're completely destitute. And
infanticide and killing of the old is something that happens when we're completely destitute.
Also now.
Yeah, so you know where I'm going with that. The United States is fabulously wealthy, and we do kill our elderly and the innocent unborn by the thousands a day. So how do you reconcile that? So
I think the moral implications of that are different for us than if we were starving, right? Like, I think it's far worse for us than for. I mean, it's bad for anyone.
I'm just thinking about inclination to sin, because you did make an interesting claim there that our inclination to sin is greater when we are poor than when we are rich. I find that hard to swallow, brother.
So maybe different types of sins.
Okay.
Right. So I think, I mean, everyone is tempted to sin. I think that's very true. I think there are some ways in which you can be pushed out of necessity to do things you might otherwise not want to. So it might not be an inclination. Like, it might not be that I desire, like the student who cheats on a test, right? The student cheats usually because they don't know the right answer. If they knew the right answer, they might not cheat.
That's a good point. It's an interesting point, and I'm going to be hard on you on this one because you are a moral theologian. So, and you're a linebacker, so I can try to push through this line a little bit. Former linebacker. Yeah, I don't know. I find that very difficult to reconcile when I think about the words of our Lord, and blessed are the poor in spirit, and who he interacted with, and in his own poverty. And then I think about all of the saints who have ever lived, and the vast majority of them were not wealthy. So I think that's actually a point in your favor, because one of the attributes of the saints that we try to mimic is their strength in overcoming temptation. And if they didn't have those temptations, then they wouldn't have to build those muscles of resisting that temptation. So if it's a poorer person, they're going to have to really demonstrate more fortitude, right?
So that's true. That's true. I mean, I guess I look at it like all suffering has the potential to shape us for the better, right? Because we push through it. But as an external observer, I should still try to relieve that suffering whenever I can.
Absolutely.
So I think it's true that I mean, he's thinking on a social level. It's true that impoverished people they get grit, right? Maybe maybe they give up and they lose all grit. That can happen too.
Yeah.
Um,
I was poor once, and I did give up everything. So
oh,
I get
really?
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean that. So I think a lot depends on sort of how we grew up. So I grew up in a small town east of Pittsburgh. It was a coal town. It's not a coal town anymore. It's a former coal town. And a
lot
lot
of those in America.
there are a lot of those. We also had a state school there. So I grew up thinking that professors were rich, which tells you something about my town.
I used to think that about lawyers. I know a lot of poor lawyers.
It's true. It's true. I mean, but everything depends, like where you see. So even if you read Plato's Republic in Book 1, he's talking to the rich man, and I mean, one of his key questions early on is, did you build this or did your dad, right? And he wants to know because how we engage with money depends so much on our history with it. But I guess I look at Smith as largely wanting to help that suffering as part of a bigger moral project. Now, he's also very worried about money corrupting people. He's worried about people looking at rich people as if they're virtuous when they're not.
Yeah.
Because that could be a real problem where people see someone and it's like, this is what you're supposed to be, and they're doing all kinds of bad things, and then they adopt those habits.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we are going to dive a little bit more into Adam Smith and capitalism in general and specifically here in a minute. And I'd like to talk about the juxtaposition with St. Thomas Aquinas a little bit. St. Thomas Aquinas has a lot of opinions about money, some of which I'd actually boldly say are a little off. And certainly not, and some of them I would say aren't even relevant to our modern economic system in some ways because it's just so radically different from what he experienced. Topics of usury and lending and interest and things like that, certainly. So what is your position on Thomas Aquinas relative to Adam Smith?
Right. So Aquinas gave me two things. So one, I needed a Catholic framework, a theory of justice that fit within this broader Catholic view. He also was very much concerned with justice, right? In a way, like he took seriously the idea that there could be justice in exchange as a real meaningful category where I could say to myself, is this exchange that I'm participating in now just? Whereas for Smith, the fact that it's happening basically means that it's just, right?
Right.
It's a free exchange in a competitive marketplace. This is good. And for Aquinas, that may or may not be true.
Right. Well, Adam Smith had to employ significant mystical thinking in order to make his theory cohesive, frankly. I mean, we've all heard of like the invisible hand, right? There's no such thing. So it's a type of mysticism. So it's interesting, though, you're using Aquinas as sort of a theological overlay to interpret Smith, it seems like. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I would say I was more thinking from Aquinas first, right? And trying to resurrect the theory of just price, which I think we need to be thinking about justice in our actions. I think
what is justice?
Justice is rendering the other her due.
Okay.
So that's the question: is what is due, right? What do I actually owe the other person?
Yeah.
But it first implies that there can be like a just title, right? There has to be something that's due, so we have to be able to articulate that. In this case, it's pretty much strict commutative justice. I need to give something of equal value. And of course, we're sitting here post development of economics, like, well, what do you mean by value, right? And that was what intrigued me, partly because I wanted to make the case that God mattered with respect to economics.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I found really intriguing was David Hume. So Hume is another Scottish Enlightenment philosopher.
Not a fan of that guy.
Yeah. So he doesn't believe things. He's not. I mean, he's a fairly thoroughgoing skeptic. So I read him as someone who's basically a strong advocate of practical atheism, the idea that whether or not there's a God is irrelevant for how one would live one's life, which I think
what's the good life for Hume? The good life for Hume is sipping wine and looking at art.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, now I think he's a traditionalist in a lot of ways. So I think he thinks you could get rid of God and life could be pretty much the same because we're.
Well, we've tried that.
We have.
It's not going great.
But Hume was very much in line with Smith on economics. So the question for me was whether there's sort of a practical atheism built into Smith.
Oh, I would say it's undeniable.
Right. And so the point where we most touch on economics, right? It's these exchanges, right? So if I could find sort of a lever where you sort of need God undergirding this justice and exchange, like this is the difference God makes in this space. That's what I was thinking before I started writing, was to try to find the difference that God's making in that space.
Okay, I hear you. And I guess, where I part ways with the isms, so capitalism, communism, socialism, whatever, other than Catholicism, is the question of what is a man? Like, what is a human person? And Marx has an answer, and Smith has an answer, and Christ has an answer. And they are not in congruency. So if I were to ask you the question, I'm going to ask you the question, what does Adam Smith, or who does Adam Smith say a human being is at our core? What are we?
That's a great question, and I don't know how to articulate that because I don't know if he ever defines it.
Well, it's the fundamental building block of his entire theory, right? Because there's no such thing as a means of exchange or a value exchange or anything else without human actors. And actually, that's probably my biggest dissent from Smith and capitalism, is the redefinition of the human being from imago Dei, or as Augustine said, "My heart is restless till rests in you." Theosis, these types of concepts of what a human being is. And of course, we have the telos himself, who is Jesus Christ. So, echo homo, right? I think it is. Behold the man.
So one way in which Smith differs, his moral psychology, right, built on sentiments. So compare that to like the moral psychology you would find in Aquinas, that is like reason driven.
Professor, right? Back up. What is moral psychology?
So it's all of those things going on inside of your head that makes you be a rational agent.
I don't have enough of those.
A moral agent, right?
Oh, I got those.
So you have to have a picture of what's going on in the thought processes that go from consideration to action, right? Okay. And Aquinas has room for the passions. He has room for emotions. But in a properly functioning human, your emotions are governed by your reason, right? And God, as ultimate good, sort of anchors all of this.
That's fair. I think that's a good answer. I have a problem with the term moral psychology on an application to Adam Smith because psychology didn't exist at the time of Adam Smith, and psychology as a body of study of the human mind and all of those things. Of course, we don't have that until Freud. And so I guess maybe my challenge to you, sir, is how do we apply a concept of a discipline of study anachronistically to Adam Smith? Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, I'm anachronistic a lot.
Me too. We share that. We share that right. In common.
I mean, and part of it is because I'm not interested in these thinkers just from a historical point of view. So like one could say, try to trace out the genealogy of all the bad ideas, right? The history of the bad ideas.
Beginning with original sin and then coming all the way to us.
Right. And you could fight over the details of like whose fault was it? And there's always somebody will say, oh, this person screwed it up. And then somebody else will say, no, they got it right. It was somebody before them. And we could fight over the history, but I'm more trying to figure out what I can steal. So Aquinas does this. What can I take to plug in to develop a way of viewing the world now?
Got it.
That's useful for us.
I think that's a good way to do it. So before you continue on that subject, on anachronism and moral psychology or whatever, I have a problem with Adam Smith and capitalism, and I want you to help me solve it. So capitalism is a confined system of ideas, right? It's a defined term. And so we can think of capitalism as a term. It's like a box, and we just put things into it. Yep, that's capitalism. Yep, that's capitalism. Yep, that's capitalism. Capitalism in its heart is not moral. It really has nothing to do with morality and has everything to do with material exchange. And my argument is that judged in itself, capitalism as its own body of knowledge, its own study, it must smuggle in the ideas of Aquinas and Christ and the Catholic Church in order for it to be at all functional for human beings. Does that make sense so far?
I think so. Yeah. So,
for example, let me make it more specific. The proper end of man is the love of God. The proper end of capitalism is the maximization of profit. Would you disagree with that?
No, that sounds right.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Would you then agree that it is possible for a human person to have a conflict between the proper end of capitalism, acting as a good capitalist, and the proper end of man, giving to us by God through revelation, the love of God? Is it possible for there to be a conflict in that decision making?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So if there's a conflict in that, we must, as Catholics then, bring some of this over here of Catholicism into capitalism in order to even do this. But now we've changed capitalism from capitalism as a box of things to capitalism plus.
Yeah. I mean, it might even be easier to say that the capitalism as a category isn't as useful, and that markets are useful, right? Like talking about the role of markets in life is a little easier because there's no finality to it. And I actually think part of what Aquinas is doing is calling into question money as an end, right? So his whole analysis of business, analysis of trade is rooted
I believe you used the term metaphysical monstrosity.
I did use that term.
So let's go ahead and use that term. I like it.
Yeah. I like alliteration. You're going to notice a lot.
I did notice. Yes.
It's because my dad was an English teacher before he became a pastor. So
that's cool. So he had a lot to say when he's on that pulpit.
He did. But the idea is, so we say in a trade, right? You're trading to make money. Money's your end, but money can be exchanged for anything, right? So it's really a non-end. And empty signifier, you could say. Aquinas doesn't use this language. People will say it's importing it into Aquinas.
I think we're very specific here, though. Money can be exchanged for anything material.
That's fair. Right. But insofar as, let's look at food, right? Like food has an ordering to me that's like given, right? And I know that there's two types of limits that are sort of lacking. This comes from Aristotle. One is the ordering to a specific good. So that's lacking, but also the amount, right? So with food, if I eat too much, I'm sick. I do this on a regular basis. It's not good for me. And I know, if I have too many wings, I know I had too many wings. I don't feel good, right? And that's a limit on my consumptive desire. So
That's
many other things, like they come with these natural limits, but there is no natural limit with money. You can store, especially now that it's not even physical.
$36 trillion in federal debt. Just like magic numbers.
Yeah, and in a computer. I mean, that could go on and on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have this ordering that sort of tailors it to the human good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he's worried about. He thinks, so it's sort of anti-metaphysical insofar as it's not ordered to our nature as humans, our good as humans. And so you end up in this space, this activity that seems like it's ordered, right? Like you have so much purposefulness, apparently, in the acquisition of money, and yet it's not ordered to a good. So it's sort of a purposeless purposiveness.
Yeah. And I think what you're actually touching, Professor, is, rest his soul, MacIntyre's critique of the application, or our inability to apply virtue to anything because we've lost the language entirely. And, you're referencing Aristotle, but and I think you're correct. I don't think Adam Smith really cared what Aristotle had to say.
Yeah, I mean, there are interesting ways in which you can try to draw parallels. I mean, he does talk a lot about virtues, but there's a different meaning, right? It's taken out of context, which MacIntyre would clarify. Yeah,
that's exactly right. So that's interesting. You talk about how there's no natural limit to greed, frankly, right? And I think what you're really sussing out here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is there are those sins which have natural limits to them. Lust to some degree, physically, of course, gluttony, and so on and so forth. And then you have over here sins that have no natural limit and that are actually in some ways far more severe for the soul: pride, greed, these types of things which capture humanity's unlimited ability to sin, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we think about Adam Smith and this concept that he's brought to bear of the exchange of value between willing participants, would it be fair to say that Adam Smith is the first one to sort of sacramentalize the concept of consent, and that if something is consensual between two persons, the exchange of goods in this example, that it has already been elevated to a high virtuous moral act? Would you say that's true, or would you say that he would not agree with me?
So I think you might want to go back as far as Locke for the sort of elevation of consent, and I would say it's probably put stronger now than Smith would probably be okay with, is my bet. But yes, it's much grown or elevated.
I think and it's very funny though, because here we were riffing about how we could just trace things back and back and back, and whose fault is it? And we just did it with Locke. But in all seriousness, I think if Adam Smith were alive today, he would be a liberal atheist.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
And why do you think that?
Now you're interviewing me.
I am. So
that's okay. I'll tell you because fair enough. I'll take it as good as I give it. I think it's because God is irrelevant in his economic system, and he hung on to virtue and divinity because he was a fish in the water. That was the sea in which he swam in at that period of time in human history, and that his theories of economics would be perfectly fine in a liberal atheist milieu.
Right. So the one thing he has going for him is a sort of ordering of nature towards it, and then so even though he he doesn't really say, "Oh, it's God doing this," right? At least not always explicitly. Sometimes he's using these turn of phrases.
Yes.
You have this ordered universe that seems like there's reason behind it, which a lot of our atheists no longer see. Right? Like he could see a world that was ordered. So it's not so much a question of why should I be moral as why are we moral? Because we are moral creatures. Like he could see it, and I think later we're starting to look around and not even seeing any order. At least the liberal atheist who looks out at the world, they can't see that blueprint.
No. And I think it's largely irrelevant to his system. I would argue that virtue is highly relevant to our system, but is just ignored in exchange for what Smith would posit, I believe, is that proper end of man within his economic system, which is this means of exchange thing. And we have gone a whole hog, right? I mean, I am a portfolio guy, right? I'm a finance guy. So, here I am being the biggest hypocrite of all. But I don't think that virtue is a necessary concept in Adam Smith's theories. And I think that, and I'm happy to be corrected by you because you are the expert on this. I would argue that the only reason he included virtue was just so that people would even read it. That if you were to rewrite his books, what's the point? What's the point of virtue?
So I think he cared more than a Hume, and I do. So
that's the low bar.
Okay, that's fair. But he does talk. One of the questions he asks in the Theory of Moral Sentiments is whether the path of virtue and the path to greatness are aligned or not, right? And he actually comes to this conclusion that like when you're less well off, they're aligned, right? Because you think you have industry, like you're hardworking, you're responsible, you're not a spendthrift. This helps you. But then he thinks there are some points at which they just radically diverge, right? And you can make a lot more money sometimes being dishonest in the right way. I haven't figured that hustle out yet, but I'm working on one.
Well, John, I wanted to. I actually think the historicity of Adam Smith is really highly relevant to this discussion. He's writing post monastic closures, right? So all the monasteries have been seized or closed in England and Scotland. It's about 100 years after that's happened. The rise of reason, which really wasn't the rise of reason at all, really the deification of reason, with the pinnacle being the goddess of reason herself being put on the altar of Notre Dame, right, during the Revolution. So if we think about Adam Smith writing in this period, his understanding of economics is completely away from monastic economics, right? And I think this is really, really important because we think about the rich young ruler coming to Christ, right? Comes to Christ and says, I follow all the laws. I've done everything I should. What else must I do to be saved? And he says, give away everything you own and come follow me. And he walks away sad, right? That story has no place in Adam Smith's economics because there's no monasticism.
So, in his views of monasticism, were not very high, right?
Right, because so that's the era he lives in.
Yeah, but then you look at someone like Weber, right?
Yeah,
Weber, who then looks back at monasticism and sees in it some of the origins of capitalism, right? Because you have these monks who are working,
industrious.
And they just keep ending up with money, right? Yeah. Even though they're trying to eschew well, which I think there's something to that, right?
Of course. Absolutely. Yes, because God is not to be outdone in generosity. And so monks and religious sisters, and these are the folks who are infinitely generous, hopefully, as much as they can be, towards the Lord, and the Lord responds with caring for them, right? But I guess my point is here is monasticism is irrelevant to his economic theories, but are not irrelevant to the Christian life. And so therefore he misses an entire aspect of what it means to be a man or a woman in this world.
Yeah.
Okay. So we agree. So he's not a saint. No, Saint Adam Smith.
Definitely not. No. A lot of times I think that, like, if you're going to develop a theological position, I think it's really helpful to engage the non-Catholic, the non-believer, because they help you to figure out what needs to be articulated that otherwise you would just, like, you believe it, so why does it need to be said, right?
Right.
So you kind of need this opposition to help you better understand what it is that's been handed on to you.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I say, and I want to talk about some of the more modern concepts of economics that we're facing now as Catholic men and women in this world. there's an old saying, you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And I think we can say the same thing about economics, right? You may not be that interested in stocks and bonds and futures and derivatives, but it is the entire ocean that all of us live in, especially in the United States, right? So the relevance here is extreme, both for our material concerns as well as for our spiritual concerns. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And so, looking at it from a modern perspective, we have folks that are watching, listening to this podcast who are thinking, is investing even moral? Like Adam Smith obviously believed in investing. I would argue to some degree Aquinas did not, although it's a very complicated problem because investing back then is a different animal than it is today, entirely, categorically different. What do you think, John? Do you think that investing is a moral thing, like a good thing, a virtuous thing in itself, or does it have to have something smuggled in to make it virtuous?
Now, well, there was this one fellow who had a parable about burying the talents.
Yeah. I think I've heard of this.
So I mean, if Jesus can use that as a metaphor, right? Mm-hmm. Then presumably the activity it's based on isn't bad, right? So that would be my first go-to, is that Jesus is sort of underwriting a principle of investing. Okay. But beyond that, I think absolutely. I think the trouble is that business activity and investing in a lot of ways in particular is what I would call a void. So it's not inherently tending towards the good or the bad. And that
you would say it's a neutral act.
Not a neutral act. I think that it will either tend one way or the other when you do it.
Well, in the act itself, let me challenge you a little bit. So you have the idea of the act, and then you have the actual function, right? And your argument is the moral qualities don't develop until the function is actually processing. So then I would just back it up and say the idea of investing itself is not neutral and has either a virtuous quality or a sinful quality intrinsic to itself. Where would you fall there?
So I want it to be the case. Like, I think it's the case.
I love when you say I want it to be the case. There's so many things I want to be the case. I want investing to be very morally good.
Yeah. So I want it to, I do want it to be the case that it can be good, right? Yeah. And I'd like us to order it, but I think it requires us to define it more than it is, right? It requires us to harness the power of investing and orient it in a way it's not inherently oriented to.
So how about this? Let me put it this way. If we see investing as a way of expanding Christ's kingdom and bringing more souls to Christ, then we're sort of backing into investing and redefining the term to be something Christian. And when you do that, it becomes morally positive. But if you don't do that and you do the current ordering that we have, which is take care of yourself first, others second if there's leftover, and then, charity stuff for tax write-offs. If we flip that upside down and we say our money is oriented first to God, second to others, and then finally to ourselves, it rebuilds the concept within a Catholic system, kind of extracting it from the capitalist system or maybe smuggling it. Does that resonate?
Yeah. So the only one addition I would make is that because investing is this type of activity where we've got to impose this from the outside, we're always going to have to struggle with the pull the other direction.
Oh, yes, of course. I think that's undeniable. I mean, our Lord said that money is the root of all types of evils, right? And so anytime we're dealing with money, we are going to be dealing with the potentiality of all types of evils. Yeah, it's a dangerous road to hoe. And I was just thinking about St. John Chrysostom. And he said, in one of his, I don't know if you've ever read his sermons. Yeah, I mean, they're shockingly challenging, I would say, especially on economics. You probably read the famous sermon that he gave to all the rich folks in his area. And there's a great quote where he says, "A man with 2 coats has stolen one from the poor." And I don't know how to reconcile that with capitalism and Adam Smith. Do you?
How many coats do you have?
Me? This is one of 6 sweaters I own. They're all black, though. No, but which makes it worse. But it's a challenge, and I have a hard time reconciling modern economic theory with our Lord. I just don't see it as easily woven into a common blanket, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think if you can do it easily, you didn't do it correctly, right? So I think partly the nature of economics is such, the nature of business is such that you're always that overcoming of its sort of lack of bent towards the good means that it's always going to be one of degree.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's like a black or white. Yes, I'm doing it right. No, I'm doing it. I think it's degrees of doing it right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's some freedom in there for the Christian to figure out what's possible. Because sometimes, I know of business people for whom, yes, I would like to pay this worker more, but if I do, I won't
Go
be
out of
paying them
business.
anything. Right? Yeah. So there's often degrees of like what is possible. But if you're creative, I mean, a lot is possible.
And really what you're just saying is we have to use the virtue of prudence in our decision making, right? I mean, of course, that's like fundamental to every choice that we make, especially in economics, right? If we're not prudential in our portfolio management or budgeting of our household expenses, we won't have anything at all. And so when a business is hiring employees, prudentially, they need to decide wages both as a positive good for the worker, but also as a positive good for the enterprise itself. And so there's a balancing act, right, that has to take place. And so the Bernie Sanders answer of everyone gets paid a living wage, well, 20% unemployment. That's the trade, right? Whereas I think a more practical approach would be to say, well, let's bring prudence into bear here and try to balance these things with a moral calculus.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're on the same page. So
Yeah.
let's do a thought experiment. Let's pretend that St. Thomas Aquinas is transported in the future to today. And he's going to join us on our podcast, sometime, and you're going to give me some advice. How would he view the modern economic system that we are currently employing in your mind?
I think he would. I think his mind would be blown for a second, right? Because it's so
It's like, what's this iPhone thing?
so radically different. It is. It's radically different. I think he'd be worried. I think he would see us as. Now he was a defender of trade in his day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we should understand that he was like as they go, he was pretty pro market for the 13th century.
That's a funny way to put it. Yeah. It's like pro individual rights, during the Inquisition, no big deal.
Yeah. So I think he would be very worried about like over financialization would be a real worry.
Meaning giving a value to everything, including time and human life.
Yeah, but also, I mean, just the vast amount of resources that we've put into finance relative to other industry, which I think should be a concern. I mean, obviously you're in finance. I think finance is good. Somebody needs to do it and somebody needs to do it right. Right. But I would say now when you're graduating, like you're looking at the college graduates, it's been the case for a while that the very best go into finance. Right. And is that always what we want?
Well, let's look at it from Adam Smith's perspective and kind of challenge St. Thomas on this. If money truly has no final determinate end, like it's ambiguous in what it's connected to, right? It would seem by logic that the finest minds and the most moral minds would go into finance because it increases the optionality, because the more money they have, the more good moral choices they make. The problem is we don't make good moral choices, right? And so we're teaching people how to make lots and lots of money, but we're not teaching people how to employ virtue.
Yeah, and I also worry about so if you think of price set by supply and demand, right? You've got your two curves, which of course nobody ever shows you those two curves when you hire an employee, right? You're just acting, and these are supposed to be somewhere in the ether,
I guess,
behind. But if you look at that supply curve, that's all set by our desires.
Yes.
And I know a lot of people with bad desires, including me, right?
Oh, so you're saying supply is set by demand then?
Or like demand, yeah. So the demand curve is those are our desires, right? Which can be virtuous or vicious.
So you are not a supply side economics guy. You are a demand guy.
I think there's an ethics of both sides.
Okay.
But I think that we as consumers, like we bear some fault in allocations that happen because we're like our vices create markets.
Like
Our
we
virtues
all
create
want to
markets
live
too.
forever in perfect health, and so we can't figure out why Medicaid and Medicare are bankrupt
Yeah. Yeah,
because
I
we
think
have an unlimited desire to be healthy.
yeah.
Interesting. So Aquinas would be a critic of the American system. I think that's undeniable. He was also, a Dominican, right? And
Yeah.
so he wouldn't be out there, I don't know, living lives like we do. So would Adam Smith and St. Thomas Aquinas been friends?
I mean, it depends whether Adam Smith could keep his mouth shut with regard to his comments about monkish virtues.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, no,
He didn't
but I
keep his
mean,
mouth shut.
no. So I could see them having some intense arguments.
Hmm.
But I think one thing that's true of Aquinas is that he always takes whatever the other person says, he finds the truth in it, and he integrates it into his system. So whoever's got the strongest position against them, like he always brings it up in the objections, and then he finds a way to take whatever principle that they're relying on that's true, put it in his. He's like the Borg,
Yeah,
right?
He
Star Trek.
he consumes it. There's
Yeah.
resistance is futile.
Yeah. So then there's nothing left to stand on when you're the opposing view because you've just presented your strong argument, and now it's part of his theory, not yours.
So oh, that's funny. So your idea is maybe he would challenge Adam Smith by kind of inculcating his economic theories into Catholic theology rather than bringing Catholic theology into the capitalist side.
I think so. I think to whatever extent is possible, I think he would. He would provide distinctions where there aren't distinctions, in order to account for what's true and what's not true. Like he would distinguish. He always distinguishes. But I think if he were alive today, he would be drawing on Kant. Also, because Kant has been such a major figure in modern philosophy.
Unreadable.
Also that. Yeah.
I'll leave them to you. Kierkegaard too. Don't get me started. So, we think about, my friends over at New Polity. You know New Polity?
Yeah.
Very good guys, and they have a very particular outlook on economics and investing, right? And they basically argue that all forms of modern investing are immoral, and you don't believe that.
No, and neither does my 401k.
We should look at that 401k though. You might be doing bad things in there, but so their argument, whatever it may be, I'll let them make it. What's your argument against it? I mean, when they say all investing is immoral, why not?
So, I think there's part of the issue is participation, right? It's possible to participate in something that's immoral for remotely, right? I think a lot of times that's what I would point to when I say yes. I invested in this. I do see concerns, but I think that my investment is not. It's not formal cooperation with evil. So that's a question, right? Of to what degree am I cooperating in evil? I mean, just on the notion of it, I don't think that every investment has to be usury, right? I would.
Can you define usury? You were just going to, because nobody can define this for me. I keep getting like 10 different definitions depending upon person's inclination to how it operates. So give me yours, please.
So it's benefiting unjustly from a loan. I think that's what we would call it. And it's usually, so for Aquinas at least, there's this idea that both sides of the exchange have to be equal.
Yeah.
He would consider any interest whatsoever on a loan to be usury.
Yeah.
So I would distinguish things differently than him. I mean, he has a couple reasons why you could receive payment. Like, for instance, if you're going to lose money because you don't have the money, then you can recompense your loss.
So
right?
Usury is properly defined always a sin, 100% of the time. Yeah, I agree. Lending, maybe not. Right. That's the kind of debate that we have. Right. So I'm going to I'm going to ask you a question, and you could just tell me usurious, not usurious. So sin, not sin.
Okay.
A poor person comes to me and says, I can't afford lunch. Would you give me a loan? I say, sure. Here's $20. Pay me 21 when you get a chance.
Yeah, I would consider that to be usury.
Sin.
Yeah.
Okay. I own a bank. Someone comes to me and says, I'm going to buy a new home. I need to borrow $300,000. I'm going to pay you back over 30 years at inflation plus 4.
So I think that requires a longer argument, right? So I think the answer is probably that's fine, right?
Not usurious.
Not usurious, yeah.
Okay.
But it might depend who they're loaning to or lending to, because if the person is unlikely to be able to pay back, right? Like, let's say,
Oh, they do that all the time. They love that because then they take the property, especially in California. Yep.
Yeah. So I think part of it depends. So Hilaire Belloc talks about productive and unproductive loans. And I think that if you use that category, the idea behind productive loans, right? You're lending money, and then they're winning, you're winning, right? And so you're paid out of the winnings. I think in practice that looks a lot more like partnerships, which Aquinas does allow. So
that's interesting. Okay, because you're partnering with the bank and you're making a deal with the bank saying, I'm going to pay you X. If I don't, you can have the house.
Right. But so the idea behind a partnership is both people lose when you're unsuccessful and both people win when you do.
I just don't see it. How does the bank lose?
So So when they give that house back, right? Are they making money, or are they just recompensing what they lost?
I think that they are taking a gamble, making a prudential judgment on the ability of the borrower to repay, the interest rate that's going to derive over 30 years. They're getting over 30 years. And they're also taking a gamble on the probability of default to recapture that asset, the house. And you talked about pre-2008. I mean, this stuff still happens today, I promise. The bank is looking at the house. And they're like, oh, it's a $2 million house in Malibu. We'll happily take it back because it's going to be worth $3 million in 10 years.
Right. So then that would be usury because you're profiting when the other person loses, like on a atomistic framework run through Belloc. But let's say it was only worth $2 million, right? So they load you $2 million. The house is worth $2 million. They take the house back. Maybe they pay. You get your equity out of it. Maybe right, because they're going to sell it. If it sells for more than what you owe, you get the change. They're going to sell it at a loss anyway because they want to get rid of it quickly, and you're going to be in bad shape. But in theory, you might look at it as just return of principal. If it was just return of principal, then I think Aquinas would say, okay, well, you got your principal back. That's fine. If you profit and the other person lost, then there's a big problem.
In the loan.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to happen incidentally all the time, right?
Yeah. So that would be where usury would be baked into a system then. If you're profiting when your borrower loses, it's not a partnership. So the idea is behind aligning the incentives, because partnerships, Aquinas thinks, are great, right? And it's a good thing because otherwise no business would happen, right? But the problem is when the interests aren't aligned, there's a sort of predatory nature in lending that ends up being, I don't know, it's socially destructive.
Oh, I think that's undeniably true. We've watched banking eviscerate entire swaths of the American populace, especially the poor, right? I mean, we look at payday lending or other types of lending that are more analogous to the loaning someone $20 for lunch to get the 21 after lunch, more like 28 after lunch, than it is to a traditional mortgage. But the banks seem to kind of merge all these things into one big thing they do. So to continue this little examination, If I deposit money at JP Morgan Chase Bank, actually, let me pick someone I don't really like. Let's say Wells Fargo. I put some money into Wells Fargo's bank.
Wells Fargo, there's all kinds of bad stuff.
Yeah,
right?
I don't know anybody who likes Wells Fargo except the people who own it, I guess. But I deposit money into my checking account. I am loaning money to the bank. Most people don't realize that. But when you put money in a checking account, you are loaning money to the banking institution. They're doing stuff with it. Okay. If the bank were to go out and then take my money and loan it to Planned Parenthood, which they do all the time, am I participating in the sin of the bank by receiving interest?
Right. I mean, I would say it feels somewhat remote insofar as they're lending to a whole bunch of different people. I have no control whatsoever, or even generally foreknowledge as far as who they're loaning to. So I don't worry about that so much. Maybe I should.
Maybe
I should.
I don't know. It's an interesting thing. It's just not so obvious.
Right. But maybe the question, so when I talked earlier about degrees, right? So there's also the question of like, how good could I be as opposed to what can I get away with, which is different, right? So if you look at the options and like there's a credit union that's not doing these things and Wells Fargo is, then maybe I choose the credit union that's not. And choosing between options, one of which is better, is often something that we can do.
What about equities? You talk about stocks. So you talk about having to make this choice, between a credit union or Wells Fargo. What about in your individual investment decisions? Does it matter which companies you own and which you're profiting from, or is it so remote that it does not matter?
So I think it does. But I also think a lot of times when people say, like, what is ethical investing? They make bad choices, right? So I know I bought some stock in an electric company that has happened to have a bunch of wildfires. They happen to be in California, where it's really hard
Is
to
it
run.
Pacific Gas and Electric?
It's not that one, no.
Oh, yeah, they're a doozy.
But this particular, like they every so often there's a fire that they're going to start, right? Because they're running electricity through these super dry areas.
Yeah.
And so the one time the price just plummeted. And it was like, well, is there anything that I can see that they did something negligent? Or is this just, you're running electricity through a bunch of brush, it's going to catch fire, and you're going to be responsible for it. You're going to have a payout. I didn't see anything. I talked to a buddy who was investing in it. And so we both bought a decent amount. It was a great return. I don't feel guilty about that because I don't think that they did anything wrong. Even though there was a wildfire, some people did die.
Okay. Because it's an accident. They're not purposely setting on wildfires. Right. That'd be a terrible investment.
If they had done something where it was like very clear that they were intentionally not repairing things.
Okay. Well, that happened. That actually happened in California. Remember? I don't know if you remember, there was a natural gas line that exploded in San Francisco and killed a bunch of people about 10 years ago. And it turned out that, they were negligent. But because their end as capitalists was maximum profit, not God, right?
Right.
That's every single time we sin, we're choosing something other than God, right? So in 2021, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops released their investment guidelines for themselves. And one of the prohibitions that I've actually found surprising is we are not permitted to invest in the privatization of water. So a company like, I don't know, I think there's a company called American Water Works. This is not an endorsement to buy that. The church doesn't like this. What do you think?
Yeah. Now that you frame it this way, I'm not going to go against another church.
Yes, please tell me about your descent from the Catholic Church. I'm just messing with you.
Yeah, I mean,
because it's different than power, right?
Right. I mean, they're regulators, right? So I think I feel comfortable with like investing in electric companies. I do that a good bit.
Okay.
Try to find them at a time when they're somewhat distressed, but for reasons that aren't morally problematic to me.
Okay.
Because great dividend and sometimes good stock appreciation too. But
utilities. But we're not allowed to do that with water. The church has said, we're done with this. Which doesn't seem that different. I mean, we have a preferential option for the poor as Catholics, right? We're always supposed to prefer the poor, number one. Number two, every single human person has the right to drink water, natural right from God. And so the gatekeeping of water behind price is a problem for us. I mean, we really cannot be fully capitalistic.
Yeah.
It's not possible. We would immediately be sinning, I believe. Is that true?
I mean, I believe it. I mean, there's the universal destination of goods, right?
Yes.
That's the principle behind this that they're leaning on.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in theory, it might be possible to have a private company that's regulated where there's a price set, right? But then that's basically not much different.
It's just a government entity then.
It's a government entity. Yeah.
But we don't have that.
Right.
We don't have that. And we don't have that with housing. We don't have that with water. We don't have that with food. If there was a company that could figure out how to charge us to breathe, it would happen. And I would argue that is the natural outgrowth of Adam Smith's system, the monetization and the commercialization of every single aspect of human life. It's many, many years ago, I worked for a medical malpractice firm. And if somebody died in a medical event, we would try to calculate what that human life was worth in monetary value, which is kind of insane if you think about it, but it is something that we have done. And so whether it be water, human life, whatever, we find a price tag for it. And I would argue St. Thomas Aquinas would be revolted. It would be disgusting to him. What do you say?
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the dominant questions in economic ethics is, are there illicit markets, right? What are the limits to markets? So one of the key pushes has been to figure out how to contain markets, how to contain that sphere, because otherwise it does overrun everything. My focus has always been, how do we transform what's going on within it? But I think both pressures are necessary.
Fair.
You need to keep it in its space, and you need to orient it rightly.
Of course. I love you theologians. You're very high level folks. So let's get a little practical. Can a Catholic in good conscience own cryptocurrency?
So I don't. And I mean, part of it is, it feels to me a lot like buying tulips on a bubble.
Okay.
But that's
not a moral question. That's just
it's not a moral question. It's a prudence question.
Yeah.
But so let's say it had no value, right? Let's just say it had no value. And the only reason it had value was because other people thought it did. If that's true, and I were to buy in because I know the price will go up, and then I would cash out thinking I'm smart enough to time a market, which maybe I was smart enough to do. Maybe I'm not. Probably I'm not. Let's say I did. I cashed out. I make my profit, and then price plummets to zero because they realize we might as well be buying, baseball cards.
My most controversial financial opinion is that all the currencies are going to zero. I mean, all the cryptocurrencies are going to go to zero because of the rise of artificial intelligence and quantum computing and an inability to prevent the blockchain from being altered. Complex argument.
Okay.
So your answer, yes or no? Can a Catholic own cryptocurrency?
I think it depends on answers to questions we don't have the truth on.
You're a good theologian. There's no yes or no answer.
Well, so if you agree with me that you think it has no value, right, then I would think that it would be wrong.
I don't agree with you. I think everything has value relative to what other persons are attaching to it. So, if I say this empty space in my hand is valuable, only if someone's willing to pay me for it, we determine the value together, right? So you're talking about intrinsic value, right? So you're saying a piece of property has intrinsic value, or maybe a piece of gold has intrinsic value. But in reality, nothing really does in this system. Everything is only valued based upon the meeting of supply and demand on that chart.
So in theory, there's a relationship between your demand curve and use value, right? That's not direct. In theory.
Yeah.
So I like to think of demand as being like use value mediated to I mean, the particularities of like my particularity of, great. So spoons are really useful, but I have a million of them already.
Yeah.
My demand is really low, right?
Shouldn't have more than one though, huh?
Yeah, probably, probably not. He didn't say spoons. He said
No, but he would have.
he doesn't do dishes all that often. I think Chrysostom was one of those every other day he's doing the dishes type.
He might have eaten off his hands. I mean, that guy, he was a humble man.
Yeah, maybe. But I think so. I guess part of me is taking a more normative view with respect to value that isn't like economic. But it's relevant for me insofar as if I expect that everybody that I'm selling to will lose. Like, is this how I want to win?
Well, in essence, I would push back on that one a little bit and just tell you, John, I believe that in every single financial transaction, there is a winner and a loser.
Really?
Yeah. And it's very simple. If I buy a stock for $100 a share, I'm saying, you fool, this thing's worth 200. They're saying, you fool, this thing's worth 50. One of us is right and one of us is wrong. And so there is an outcome of a winner and a loser in that transaction. That said, I'm going to ask you one last question. Index investing is a big deal. So a lot of folks that are listening to this, they have 401ks, they own the S&P 500. Inside the S&P 500 are companies that are actively working against Christ, where they're exploiting the poor, using slave labor. Maybe they're paying, they're producing literal abortion drugs, murder weapons and things like that, weapons of mass destruction, whatever. We have a whole litany of evils that we have in our world that we buy and sell every day. If a Catholic wants to invest, can they morally buy the S&P 500, the 500 largest companies in America, without distinction between what is inside that S&P 500 index fund?
Right. So can they or should they? I think that's the
well, we know they can, but should they?
Right. But like, I guess I would say that your guilt level is relatively small if you're just buying the 500 S&P 500, like, because it's very small amount, very small. Like, your participation in it is
so it's just a little bit
small.
Of evil.
It is, but I mean, the question is, when given the option, is it worth not? Right?
Well, we have options.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you it one more time. So is the person sinning if they buy the S&P 500 and choose not to even learn? They just buy it.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm more interested in the question: how grave of a sin?
Well, then your answer is yes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, probably to some degree, sure. Now, do I own any shares in the S&P 500? I do, actually, which is a question.
We should talk about that.
So we should actually. I mean, I have. There's the questions of like which ones are allowed in your 401k and all of that, which is a great question. But
well, a lot of folks don't have options, Sean. A lot of people, they open up, they go to work, they get their 401k. There's 7 things they can choose from, none of which are morally screened. What are they supposed to do? Would you advise that person to just buy what's going to get them the best return? Or would you say, don't buy those things because you shouldn't sin ever, just stay in cash?
So I wouldn't do that. Because I think so.
So you would say you should sin, but just a little bit.
Yeah. Well, so no, what I would say is you have other responsibilities too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have a responsibility to your family. I'm assuming people have families, or even to your future self, right? Like, It would be a very good thing if, when I'm an old person, I have enough money to take care of myself and I don't have to burden my kids.
Yeah.
I like that idea. So like, I'm going to take care of them now, but I'm also going to try not to be a burden on them later. Although maybe it'll help them be more virtuous.
It's a very modern idea that's never occurred in human history, to be frank.
That's fair. Mm-hmm. That's fair. It is true. But also, I want to be able to give to charity, right? These are other things. There are lots of good things we do with money.
Absolutely.
So I think you can make a strong case if you like to choose to invest in your 401k. I mean, you're at a work. I think you can do that without being too worried. I think you could be.
So it's not sinful. So you're actually.
No. I think it is.
Oh,
I think there's some sins that we can do.
so you're
That
saying it's okay to sin because the outcome would be positive.
no, I wouldn't say that either.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I would say that in instance of like remote participation,
Mm-hmm.
uh, there are a lot of things that are weighed to decide whether or not it's worth engaging in something where you're remotely participating in evil. Like there's not a keep your hands maximally clean
Mm-hmm.
rule always. I think there are other considerations when it comes to something that's a remote participation. Now, if it's not remote, then I think you can't do it no matter what. There's
Yeah,
some
I would argue
ever
it's not
do.
remote.
You would argue it's not
I would
remote.
argue it's not remote. I would say that if you own a stock, you are a owner of the company. You have voting rights, so you automatically have a responsibility to vote with those shares in order to influence company decisions. You have an obligation to advocate to the people who are representing you, which is the board of directors, to do moral things with the company. And so if you are going to own these companies in the S&P 500, it comes with the added responsibility of assisting those companies for change.
So what if I own one share?
Mm-hmm.
Because the truth is that the board is not going to be very responsive to me as the
You're
shareholder of
correct
one share.
from a formal perspective. I would agree with you that one share is not going to be moving proxy votes at a board level. However, squeaky wheel gets the grease. There are actually situations where people who own no shares have been advocating to boards and gotten them to do very evil things. And so I would argue that if you even own one share of a company, that you have an obligation as a Catholic man or woman to either band together with other Catholics or in some way yourself to say, hey, you know what, Wells Fargo, I don't want you giving donation dollars to Planned Parenthood anymore. Maybe they will ignore you, maybe they won't, but that doesn't change your obligation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I do worry about index funds, partly
Mm-hmm.
because they dilute ownership so much
Mm-hmm.
that it sort of takes away from
Mm-hmm.
this from those regulatory aspects, right? Where the governance aspects, where in theory, if you're buying a chunk of a business, you're involved, right? So that participation that we talk about, the partnership is in some sense real.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like when you own everything a
Mm-hmm.
little bit, you're very absent. It's
Mm-hmm.
everything.
It's very remote, not in the moral sense, but in just in the practicality material sense. And the reality is you can't actually buy an index. You have to buy representations of the index, which have representations of the holdings inside the index. I mean, you are like several steps removed in a 40 Act fund from actual direct ownership of those companies. And you're often pushing the proxy vote back to the people who are running the fund who make those moral decisions for you. So I guess my point is, I believe that as Catholics, we are moral actors in every economic decision that we make. And when we're investors, that we are obligated by the law of love itself to try to get these companies to stop harming the body of Christ.
Yeah. And in your business, are you mostly focused on? Well, can you tell me a little bit about like how exactly you see yourself as an agent of change on
Oh,
those fronts?
absolutely. Yeah, we have advocacy all over the place where we try to do proxy voting, letter writing campaigns, public exposure, interaction with board members. I mean, I think we always assume that board members are these like liberal atheist people that just care about maximum. There's tons of Catholic board members out there, Christian board members, people that are just not even Christian or Catholic, but just agree with us on morality. And I think our biggest advancement we've made here is just talking with people, just dialogue. Our friends over at IWP, they do a lot of research for us down in Texas. Pia De Saleni, who she and I co-host a podcast. She is leading the globe in this and going to these companies and getting them to actually change. And I think that's huge. And I think as Catholics, we could all band together. Imagine tens of millions of Catholics all stood up and said, you know what? Enough of this funny business company. They will hear you. I mean, they respond to, crazy liberal activists all the time. It's time for us to stand up and do the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
so,
great. That's wonderful.
Thank you. Well, John, I want to say it's been a pleasure talking with you. And I appreciate how patient you are with me and challenging you. and how much quality you bring to the conversation. And where could people find out more about you, or find things that you've written, or engage with you in some way?
Sure. You could go on the Lumen Christi website, or you could follow me on Twitter.
What's your Twitter?
John
It's
Buchmann.
X now, you know.
Oh, it is X. So I'm about 10 years behind the times. You'll notice.
I call Twitter too.
Yeah, look me up on Twitter. I don't post very often, but that's going to change.
What's your Twitter handle?
It's just John Buchmann.
John Buchmann.
Yeah.
Buchmann.
Mann. That's right.
Oh, that's very cool. I think that they should do that and interact with you. And I'd also like everybody watching and listening to please like and subscribe to the podcast. Share this with your friends. We're trying to get the message of Jesus Christ out there within the world of economics, especially. So if anybody can share this, we'd be grateful to you. John, it's been a great pleasure. God bless you. And thank you so much for being with us on Treasures in Heaven today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.